Welcome to the Deep Dive. You ready to dive into some fascinating Islamic theology?
Specifically, we're going to unpack the concept of Istiwā, often translated as ascending or sitting.
It's a big question, right?
Well, it's all about reconciling those verses in the Quran and Hadith that seem to ascribe human-like qualities to God with the fundamental principle that he is entirely beyond our comprehension.
And our guide through this complex maze of interpretations is going to be an excerpt from an academic article titled The Mutashābihāt Issue of Istiwā, published in the journal Istiwā, a pretty serious academic journal in their January-June 2024 issue.
You see, the Quran and Hadith are divided into two categories, muhkamat and mutashābihāt.
That's a mouthful, but think of it like this. The muhkamat are those verses that are crystal clear in their meaning, like straightforward legal terms.
Right, like verses about prayer times or fasting rules are pretty clear-cut. But then you have the mutashābihāt, which are more open to interpretation, almost like poetry.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The mutashābihāt often deal with the descriptions of God's attributes. You know, verses that might say things like, God has a hand, or God sits upon the throne.
Exactly. These verses are the ones that have sparked so much debate throughout history because in Islam, it's a big no-no to say that God is like anything in creation.
So how do you reconcile these verses with the fundamental Islamic principle of God's transcendence?
It's a challenge that has occupied scholars for centuries, and the article we're diving into sheds some light on how different schools of thought have grappled with this challenge.
So let's get back to Istiwā, the word we're focusing on. The article highlights that even in Arabic, this word doesn't just mean sitting in a physical sense.
Right, depending on the context, Istiwā can also mean achieving a state of perfection or dominion.
So like saying the king ascended to the throne could mean that he assumed his full power, not just that his royal backside landed on a cushion.
It's a great analogy. And that's crucial because interpreting Istiwā literally as God physically sitting on a throne creates contradictions with other Quranic verses.
So the question is, how do we understand these verses without falling into contradictions? And that's where the different schools of thought come in. So the article we're diving into focuses on two main approaches to this challenge within Sunni Islam.
You have the Salaf and the Khalaf.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, what's the deal with these names? Think of them as representing two distinct periods in the history of Islamic thought.
The Salaf, meaning the predecessors in Arabic, refers to the earliest generations of Muslims. They emphasize a certain approach to interpreting these types of verses.
And what was that approach? Because honestly, I'm a bit lost at this point.
That's where it gets really interesting. The Salaf generally favored a concept called tafwa. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a key concept in understanding how they approached these types of verses.
So what's the gist of tafwa?
It's all about accepting the verses as they are, without feeling the need to fully explain them. They trusted God's ultimate knowledge and emphasized that he's beyond anything we can imagine. Think of it like, you know how we see the moon, but we don't really understand how it got there, the physics and stuff? It's like that, but on a much grander scale.
Okay, that's a good analogy. So for the Salaf, it was more about accepting the mystery and trusting God's wisdom than figuring out the mechanics of it all.
Precisely. They believed that trying to understand the how of God's attributes was a futile exercise, because ultimately we can never fully comprehend the divine.
So it's kind of like, I believe, but I don't need to fully grasp 80W, a leap of faith.
Yes, exactly. And this brings us to the Khalaf, who came later and had a different approach.
So the Khalaf were like, hold on a second, let's unpack this a bit more.
You could say that. The Khalaf favored a different approach called ta'wil, which is all about allegorical interpretation.
Okay, so ta'wil is like finding a deeper meaning that doesn't contradict the basic principles of faith.
Yes, exactly. They were really into the linguistic nuances of the Quran, and they wanted to make sure that these seemingly anthropomorphic descriptions didn't clash with God's absolute transcendence.
So instead of saying, we can't understand it, they tried to find meanings that did make sense within the broader context of Islamic faith.
Yes, and they had their work cut out for them. Take Istiwā, for example. The Khalaf might interpret it as God's absolute dominion over the universe, a meaning that aligns with Arabic language rules and doesn't imply physicality.
So like the CEO sitting at the head of the company, it's about authority and control, not literal posture.
Precisely. And that's just one example. The Khalaf explored different interpretations using the tools of language and logic to reconcile these verses with the fundamental principles of Islamic faith.
This is fascinating. It's like two different paths up the same mountain, each offering a unique perspective on the summit.
And as we continue this journey of exploring different interpretations, we come to a text that has sparked a lot of controversy, the Jariyah Hadith.
Okay, this is where things get a bit spicy. Can you explain what the Jariyah Hadith is about?
Of course, it's a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that some people use to argue that God does have a physical location.
So we're talking about the Jariyah Hadith, which some people point to as evidence that God has a specific location. What's the story behind this hadith?
Well, it tells the story of a slave girl who's asked, "Where is God?" And her response is simply to point to the sky. You can see why, on the surface, this might seem like a pretty straightforward answer.
Right, it sounds like a slam dunk for the God has a physical location argument.
Exactly. But, like we've been saying throughout this entire deep dive, context is key. And when you look at the context of this hadith, some interesting questions pop up.
Okay, so like what? What's the context that we're missing?
Well, first off, this hadith appears in a chapter about prayer, not about theology. So it's possible that the slave girl's gesture is more about the direction we face during prayer than a definitive statement about God's cosmic address.
So like just because we face a certain direction when we pray doesn't mean God is actually in that direction. It's symbolic.
Exactly. It's about ritual practice, not necessarily a metaphysical map of the universe. Plus, there are questions about the reliability of the narration itself. While the narrator is generally considered trustworthy, he was known to have some gaps in his memory, which makes some scholars question the accuracy of this particular hadith. But the biggest point of contention, and this is where the Khalaf would really dig in, is that taking this hadith literally contradicts a core Islamic belief: God's transcendence.
Because if God is beyond our comprehension, beyond space and time, then saying he's just hanging out in the sky doesn't really add up.
Precisely. It limits God in a way that clashes with the concept of tawhid, the oneness of God. It's like trying to stuff infinity into a lunchbox. It just doesn't work.
Wow, so this one hadith really highlights the complexities of interpreting religious texts. It's not as simple as just reading it at face value, huh?
Not at all. It requires critical thinking, considering the context, the reliability of the source, and how it all fits within the larger framework of Islamic beliefs.
So what does this deep dive into Istiwā, the Salaf and Khalaf approaches, and the Jariyah Hadith tell us about navigating these complex theological waters?
It reminds us that there are different ways of approaching these challenging concepts. It's okay to grapple with ambiguity and to acknowledge that some things may always remain a mystery.
It's about asking the right questions, even if we don't have all the answers. It's about approaching these texts with both faith and reason.
Exactly. It's a journey of understanding and interpretation, and it's one that each generation of Muslims undertakes, adding their own insights and perspectives to the ongoing conversation.
And you know, what's really fascinating to me is that even though these schools of thought, the Salaf and the Khalaf, approach this question of Istiwā differently, they both arrived at a deep reverence for God's majesty and transcendence.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point for our listeners to take away. It's not about finding the one right answer, but rather about engaging in the process of seeking knowledge and deepening our understanding of faith.
It's about recognizing that there are different paths up the mountain of understanding, and each path offers unique insights and perspectives.
Beautifully said. And that's what makes this journey of exploring faith so enriching. It's a lifelong process of discovery and growth.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. So for all of you listening, if this conversation sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to keep exploring. Pick up a book on Islamic theology, listen to another podcast, or have a chat with someone who holds a different perspective.
Because at the end of the day, the more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to know.
And that's what makes this whole journey so exciting. So keep those questions coming, keep diving deep, and thanks for joining us on this incredible exploration of Islamic thought. Until next time.